I'm going. All right, so last time, oh, go ahead, Terry. Well,
No, I'm sorry. You go.
last time, I'm not sure we finished all the way to the end of the first daf, but I feel like we got pretty far. We got the gist. The question starts off with, what is the time frame for the evening Shema? And then we go kind of in circles around, like, how do we know what time frames are the time frames, like that the reference points the rabbis use, we don't actually necessarily know what those reference points are, so then other rabbis come and explain them. And then there's also a side conversation about, like, why are we starting with the question about the evening Shema and not the morning Shema? And they don't really answer anything, but they do ask a lot of questions and kind of circle the point. So now we're here at the top of the second daf, which is actually 3, Amud 3, or Amud A, daf 3. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Before we move on, I just wanted to, I was thinking about what we did last week.
Uh-huh.
And at first thought, especially when we were doing it, it all seemed a little trivial. I mean, it seemed, I imagine these people spending months and months of their time talking about what is evening and instead of important philosophical ideas. But the more I thought about it, I guess, Judaism is, time is very important to what happens and what will happen. And so it bears thinking about and talking about. That's all.
That's true, but I also hope you won't be disappointed when the Talmud gets even more, I don't know, mundane, perhaps, from just questions of time of day, because a lot of the Talmud is about body function. So just a warning. But here we're in Berachot, so we are talking about blessings and relevant questions around prayer. By the way, my camera sometimes freezes, and sometimes if I hit stop video, then I can start it again and it will not be frozen. And sometimes it just doesn't let me start it again. So that's why I have no picture right now. I didn't do it on intentionally. I don't know. But that's okay, because we're looking at the text together. We don't need to look at faces. So, Kashya de Rabbi Meir, de Rabbi Meir. So Kashya is an important term in Talmud because it means, it means difficulty. It's related to the same root as the Hebrew word for something is difficult. But in Aramaic, or in Talmudic language at least, it means like there is a ongoing open question here that, like, we have not, that we still have an open debate on this halachic issue that we need to resolve. So here, this is just a little recap that, so that, remember, the bold parts are the parts that are actual translation. And this is the filler so that it makes more sense to us. So the previous Baraita cited Rabbi Meir's opinion that the time for the recitation of the Shema begins when the priests immerse before taking of their truma. In the Tosefta, it was taught that Rabbi Meir holds that one begins to recite the Shema from when people enter to eat their meal on Shabbat Eve. So these are both separate sources of not quite codified material, not in the Mishnah, but from that era. The plain sense of it would probably be, like, historically, if we were to look at it rationally, that like one of the scribes got it wrong or whatever, right? Like that there's these are two different sources, so they can't really be maybe trusted to be completely in that maybe one of them is wrong. I don't know, like, but anyway, but that's not something that the rabbis are going to admit about their the generation before them. So instead they say, okay, well, so one opinion contradicts the other, but the Tere Tana'i Aliba de Rabbi Meir, well, the two Tanaim, who are the students of Rabbi Meir, express different opinions in accordance with Rabbi Meir's opinion. So commonly, rabbis would say, in the name of so-and-so, and cite their teacher, even if that teacher didn't actually say exactly that, but like, in accordance with what we learned from him, we think this would be the ruling. So these two students came to different conclusions using the same principles of logical deduction that they learned from Rabbi Meir. Kashya de Rabbi Eliezer ad Rabbi Eliezer, and the same thing, Rabbi Eliezer cited in the Mishnah, or the opinion cited in the Mishnah contradicts the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer in the Baraita. So in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer holds that the time of the recitation of the Shema begins with the emergence of the stars, which is the same time that the priests enter to partake of their truma. But in the Baraita, it credits Rabbi Eliezer with the opinion that the time for the recitation of the Shema begins when the day becomes sanctified on the eve of Shabbat. So here, can I make like a whiteboard situation? Okay, pretend this is a straight line. Okay. We've got Eliezer. And we've got Meir. And then, oh, I can't make that, move it up, whatever. And then we've got, let's say, the stars, which is also the Truma. And we've got, whoops, go back. And we've got, I don't know, what looks like a dinner stamp. This is a dinner plate. When the people come in for their evening meal or their Shabbat meal. Okay. So, according to the Baraita, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Meir agree, right? That it's here, the time of the stars, which is the same time as the Truma. According to the Tosefta, so Rabbi Meir in the Baraita and Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah agree here. In the Tosefta, Rabbi Meir says the food thing, and Rabbi Eliezer in the Baraita says the food thing. Okay, so they both have expressed like more or less the same two opinions across three different sources. Very confusing. So the Gemara responds, there are two possible resolutions to the apparent contradiction in Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Either two Tanaim express different opinions in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer's opinions, or if you wish, say that the first clause of the Mishnah, according to which we begin to recite the Shema when the priests enter to partake of their Truma, is not actually Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. I just realized there's an extra ZI in Eliezer here. Oh well, I don't know how to edit that. Okay. Only the second half of the statement until the end of the first watch was stated by Rabbi Eliezer. Ad sof ha-ashmura. Well, in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer establishes that one may recite the evening Shema until the end of the first watch. These watches are mentioned in the Bible as segments of the night, but it must be established, because it's not clear in the Bible how many segments is the night divided into. And why does Rabbi Eliezer employ such inexact parameters rather than the more precise definition of time, which I guess would be the truma or the stars? Here it's telling us that comes from this last question that's not in bold, is from Tosafot, which is Rashi's grandchildren, or the next generation of great French rabbis from Rashi's yeshiva. My kasavar Rabbi Eliezer. So what does Rabbi Eliezer actually believe? Ikasavar shlosh mishmurot havai halayla. If he holds that the night consists of 3 watches, lema ad arba sha'ot, then let him say until the 4th hour. That would be the end of the first watch, right? To 12. They have a vague idea of hours, how many hours. Ve'ikasavar arba mishmerot havai halayla, lema ad shlosh sha'ot. So then let him say until the 3rd hour. Just say what you mean, Rabbi Eliezer. Le'olam kasavar shalosh mishmorot havai halayla v'hai kamashma lan. Ooh, mashma lan is also like in order to teach us. That's a very technical term that comes up a lot in the Gemara. So the Gemara responds, Rabbi Eliezer holds that the night consists of 3 watches, and this teaches us De'ika mishmarot barakia ve'ika mishmarot be'ar'a, that there are watches in heaven and there are watches on earth. Interesting. What does that mean? So just as our night is divided into watches, so too is the night in the upper worlds. Titania, as it was taught in a Baraita. That's implied. So Titania means as it was taught, but it's a term that usually refers to a Baraita, because if it was from the Mishnah, it would probably say, it would say in the Mishnah, it could also mean in a Tosafot or a Tosefta. Anyway. Detanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Shalosh Mishmarot Havai Halayla, Ve'al Kol Mishmar Ve'mishmar, Yoshev HaKadosh Baruch Hu, HaKodesh Baruch Hu, Ve'shoeg Ka'ari. So it was taught in Braita that Rabbi Eliezer says, the night consists of 3 watches, and over each and every watch, the Holy One, blessed be He, that's God, if that's not clear, sits and roars like a lion. So in pain over the destruction of the temple. This imagery is derived from a reference in the Bible. Shana and Mar, as it is written, this always introduces a biblical quote. Adonai mimarom yishag umim on kodsho yitin kolo shaog yishag al navehu. The Lord roars from on high. From his holy dwelling, he makes his voice heard. He roars mightily over his dwelling place. And then the translator or commentator here is even finishing the verse for us here. He cries out like those who tread grapes against all the inhabitants of the earth. the three instances of the root Shin Aleph Gimel, that's the Sha'og, Sha'ag, Yish'ag, all of those. The four, well, it says three. There were definitely four in this Sho'eg. Oh no, that was in the Gemara. Okay. Yish'ag, Sha'og, Yish'ag. Okay. Correspond to the 3 watches of night. So again, we're like circling an answer here. So we're trying to narrow down how the night is divided. But we're getting off track here with this Jeremiah quote and the upper and lower worlds. And is this helping us know when to say the Shema? V'siman ledavar mishmara rishona chamor no'er. The signs of the transition between each of the upper worlds, these watches in the upper worlds, can be sensed in this world. So on the first watch, the donkey brays. Shni'ah klavim tzoakim. In the second, the dogs bark. Shlosha tinok yonik mishdei imo. And in the third, the people begin to rise. That's okay. And the baby nurses from its mother's breast, and the isha misaperet im ba'ala, and the wife converses with her husband. Okay, sure. The upper worlds, this is still heaven, so how does that correspond with the watches on earth? Let's see if we answer that. My kachashiv Rabbi Eliezer. So with regard to these earthly manifestations of the 3 heavenly watches, the Gemara asks, what did Rabbi Eliezer enumerate? I techilat mishmarot ka chashev techila mishmara rishona simana lamali. If he enumerated that the beginning of the watch, if he enumerated the beginning of the watch, meaning he established when the watch begins, why do I need a sign for the beginning of the first watch? He would just say it, right? Or tahu, it's when the evening begins. An additional sign would be superfluous. Isof mishmarot kachashev, sof mishmara achrona lamali simana. If he enumerated the end of the watches, why do I need a sign for the end of the last watch? It's Yamama, it's when the day begins. An additional sign is superfluous. Ela, okay. Rather, this is what he really said, claims the Gemara. Chashev sof mishmara reshona. He enumerated the signs of the end of the first watch and the beginning of the last watch, both of which require a sign. The emsa'it, the emsa'ita, and the middle of the middle watch, just so you know, like the basic markers of the throughout the day or night, I guess. V'iba'e ema. So if you were to say, Kulhu sof mishmarot ka chashev v'chi tema acharona la tzarich. If you wish to say, he enumerated the ends of all the watches, and if you wish to say that the sign indicating the end of the final watch is unnecessary, fine, but it could still be useful.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have a question and I'm more than happy to hold it till.
Go for it.
So when it said, he says this, he says, is there just this person's opinion? Is it based on, reference?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's based on reference, but it's also, the reference is tenuous sometimes. Like in this case, we're talking about Rabbi Eliezer's ruling on, let's see if we can find where he says it. Rabbi Yehuda, but his ruling on when the the watches and when the Shema is said, and he ties it to a verse, right? Or was that one of the other ones? But it's like, right, so this kind of stuff happens, the sunset, where it's they decide what they want what their opinion is, and then
Mhm.
they find the quote that supports it rather
Okay.
than drawing from the quote itself.
Okay.
So that's that. And then the rest of the Gemara is trying to tease out, like, does that hold? They're not bothered by the premise of this kind of like, I feel like there is there's like a debate tactic term for it in English that we would use for this, but like they're not bothered by the tactic of like pulling at strings and trying to find something that suits their opinion. They just want to make sure it actually suits and that everything is consistent, or at least consistent enough. So that's what the debate here is. Does that make sense? Did I answer that?
I'm really struggling.
Okay.
It's fascinating. But let me listen more.
Okay. Well, we're going to get one of my favorite tactics here in a moment. So
Okay,
we'll talk, we can maybe, it won't answer your question, but it
that's
will
okay.
be
That's all
an
right.
interesting new wrench in the whole schema.
This is not a research paper, you know?
That is correct. Yes. Okay. So, all right. So they were arguing about, why does Eliezer phrase the watch thing the way he does? It's not actually that helpful. Here are some timestamps. I don't know, whatever. So then, lama nafka mina, what is the practical ramification of this sign? Why is this helpful? It is relevant to one who recites the Shema, lemikra kriyat Shema, while lying in a dark house, who cannot see the dawn and does not know when the time for reciting the Shema has arrived. That person is provided with the sign that when a woman speaks with her husband and a baby nurses from its mother's breast, then the final watch of the night has ended, and such a person must rise and recite the Shema. I'm not sure if this person is like alone in a dark house, how they know that the couple next door is speaking, like how that's any more helpful than knowing the watch has ended or that dawn is breaking, but sure, okay. Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Mishmahe de Rav. So Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel said in the name of Rav. So he's quoting his teacher here. Oh, I didn't mean to open that bar. Okay. What did I do? There we go. The night consists of 3 watches, and over each and every one, the Holy One sits and roars like a lion. We heard all of that. Okay. So what is Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel in the name of Rav going to add to this? Tanya, in the Baraita it was taught, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi said, I was walking along the road when I entered the ruins of an old abandoned building among the ruins of Jerusalem in order to pray. And I noticed that Elijah, Eliyahu Zachor Latov, Elijah of blessed memory, came and entered and guarded the entrance for me and waited at the entrance until I was finished with my prayer. When I finished praying and exited the ruin, Elijah said to me, deferentially, as he would address a rabbi, greetings to you. my rabbi. I answered him, greetings to you, my rabbi, my teacher. And Elijah said to me, my son, why did you enter this ruin? And I said to him, in order to pray. And Elijah said to me, you should have prayed on the road. And I said to him, I was unable to pray along the road because I was afraid I might be interrupted by travelers and would be unable to focus. And Elijah said to me, you should have recited the abbreviated prayer instituted for just such circumstances. So I love when the rabbis just are like, oh yeah, the prophet Elijah came to me and told me I was right. It's just, that's my favorite tactic in the Talmud. So Rabbi Yossi concluded, at that time, from that brief exchange, I learned from him 3 things. I learned that one may not enter a ruin. I learned that one need not enter a building to pray, but may pray along the road. And I learned that one who prays along the road recites an abbreviated prayer so that he may maintain his focus. It's all very good and useful, but now we seem to have completely abandoned the question of when the watches are and when you should say the Shema. So I get, whoops.
Rabbi, is that typical of the?
Yes,
of the,
usually it will, well, no, I shouldn't say that. I prefer when they will at least say like, it's an unresolved question. Like often it'll end with like, all right, we don't know yet. The fact that it just drops abruptly like that means we will come back to it, but it just feels so abrupt. It's just like, okay, there was not even like a tenuous sequitur like sometimes they have. This was just, okay, now it's story time about the prophet Elijah.
and what's the connection?
And it's very hard. Well, so the connection is still that when he says prayed, they're still talking about the Shema and its blessings.
Okay.
But the time of day, like we've left that conversation for the moment.
Okay.
But this is a little important that this question, oh, I'm echoing somewhere. Debbie, did you have a question?
Only when you're done with this section.
Okay. So the focus question and like abbreviated prayer along the road, that comes up a lot throughout Berachot. It comes up especially a little bit later in Berachot when we start to talk about the Amidah. And I think it's a very fascinating, not so much like the question itself is that interesting, but the way they discuss it gives us so much insight into like what the ancient world was like. And even for, or maybe especially for rabbis, I guess, that like, that they weren't professional rabbis the way we have now. They were also like merchants and doing whatever else and on the road doing business and had to be concerned about like robbers along the road if they let down their guard to pray, and their eyes are closed for the Shema and the whole thing, like that, they discuss a lot of that sort of safety concern. And it also then it will open up the question about some of the exceptions that Rabban Gamliel makes for himself, which, how I feel about that. Okay. So, Marley, after this introduction, Elijah said to me, Beni, so he's calling him my son. I'm not sure why this translator doesn't translate that, because I think that's interesting. Beni, my son, ma kol shma'ata bechurba zo. What voice did you hear in that ruin? So I responded, I heard a heavenly voice, like an echo of that roar of the Holy One, blessed be he, cooing like a dove and saying, blah, 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 this quote from Elijah again. Woe to the, oh no, this isn't the same quote. Woe to the children whose sins I destroyed in my house and burned my temple and exiled them among the nations. And Elijah said to me, by your life and by your head, not only did the voice cry out in that moment, but it cries out 3 times each and every day. Moreover, any time that God's greatness is evoked, such as when Israel enters synagogues and study halls and answers in the Kaddish prayer, may his great name be blessed, the Holy One, blessed be he, shakes his head and says, happy is the king who is thus praised in this house. When the temple stood, this praise was recited there, but now how great is the pain of the father who exiled his children, and woe to the children who are exiled from their father's table. Woo boy. All right. Tanu Rabbanan. This means it's from the Mishnah. The sages taught. For 3 reasons, one may not enter a ruin. So now we are getting away from the issue of the Shema, except that again, it's like a tenuous sequitur from here that Rabbi Yossi went into the ruin to pray. He prayed the Shema and its blessings. Elijah said, don't do that. So we know you can't enter a ruin, and here's why. So one, because of suspicion of prostitution.
Huh.
Okay. Because the ruin is liable to collapse. That one makes a lot of sense. And because of demons. This word hamazikim refers to, I don't know enough about demonology, even though I think it's interesting and funny. It's not like a serious place of study for me. So mazikim and shadim are 2 different kinds of demon types that are referred to throughout the Talmud, and I don't know. I'm not really clear on what the difference is when they use one versus the other, but just so you know, this is mazikim. One of our recurring demon friends that the Talmud mentions several times is Yosef Shader. Yosef Shader. So Joe the demon is a shade. I don't know how that distinguishes him from the mazikim here that hang out in the ruins, but you know. So these are 3 separate reasons which seem extraneous. So the Gemara asks, why did you need to say all those things? Specifically, the suspicion of prostitution. Let's just say the halakha is derived because of the fear of collapse, because that's just like, let's just leave it there.
Yeah.
Bechadita. This halakha applies. Oh, so this is why that wasn't enough. Because it, even in a newer ruin, a recently abandoned building that's still sturdy and there's no danger of collapse, you still shouldn't enter it. So the Gemara continues to object. Okay, so then like let's leave it at the demons. Like again, why the prostitution thing? Well, the Gemara answers, well, it still applies if 2 people enter the ruin. Oh, yeah, it would still applies if 2 people enter the ruin together, and demons only attack when a person is alone. So if 2 people enter the ruin together, it would be suspicion of prostitution. But Gemara says, no, like why? That's still, I'm not satisfied with that. Nami leika, there's no suspicion there. So there's no prohibition against 2 men to be alone with a woman, as in that case, there is no suspicion of untoward behavior. I guess we're assuming that the prostitute just hangs out in the ruin. And nobody, I don't know, like you could just go check if she's there. Anyway, so consequently, if 2 men enter a ruin together, there's no room for suspicion. The Gemara answers, if 2 individuals are known to be immoral and they enter together, there's suspicion, even though there is 2 of them. We have gotten farther and farther away from the Shema question here. So it continues. We're going to kind of breeze through, see if we can get back on track. We're talking about how like the Gemara is clearly uncomfortable with this issue of suspicion of prostitution. I'm not really clear like why they don't like that, other than I guess it's, if you think it's extraneous, it's unpleasant to talk about, but like, I don't know, the Gemara talks about a lot of things that are unpleasant. This moral objection to speculating about prostitution seems uncharacteristic for the Talmud, but it can.
Rabbi, can I ask
Yeah.
a question? So the Gemara, isn't the Gemara, wasn't a collection of rabbis
Yes.
who discussed and came up with a solid or input representing all of them? That,
Yeah. So when it says the Gemara, like in this case, that's the translator sort of using the anonymous voice of the Gemara. So this is all of this argumentation about whether or not we should be suspicious of people who enter a ruin that they're going in to solicit a prostitute. There's no citation of the specific rabbis arguing.
right.
So that's why it says like default the Gemara.
So
Probably
it's a collective.
it's a collective, and most likely really when there's this whole argument that doesn't mention a single name, it's probably the Stam. Like it's probably one of the much, much, much later anonymous rabbis of the like 6th, 7th, 8th century, filling in that, like, I don't know why they thought that this was like, it really needed to be elucidated here, but they did.
So like,
yeah.
my thinking is like it feels like it came from a larger discussion.
Yes.
And for whatever reasons, these parts were culled out of that larger discussion.
Yeah. So what probably happened, I mean, obviously, like it's so hard to know for sure how it was all put together. Something that happened over 1,000 years ago and over the course of almost 1,000 years. But the rabbis, especially, or at least the rabbis of Babylonia, we know less about how the Talmud of Israel, or at the time Palestine, was constructed or saved, because we have less whole sections of it,
Right.
whole bindings of it. But the rabbis of Babylonia had a lot of this material in their heads, and they would just like, somebody would recite a piece from memory, and then they would argue. Right. And they would pull various pieces, again, entirely from memory, from every other part of rabbinic literature that had been written so far. So there wasn't necessarily a specific order, or there was an order to the Mishnah that had been codified and structured by 200, but it still hadn't been written down, I don't think. And so then as they're quoting other Babylonian rabbis, their teachers, the earlier generations, whatever, there's not exactly an order to that. So they're just pulling from their brain, like everything they remember. And then, so then when the Stam goes to write this down, they're making a lot of editorial decisions about what goes where, what gets repeated, how stuff like flows, that we cannot begin to guess what they were thinking. Okay.
That helps, because it's for such, if you will, an important document, is, to me, just looking at this or listening, it doesn't have like a consistent order.
Right.
And so I was just, I think, trying to understand how it all came about.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't have a the consistent order is in the broad strokes, right? Like, so
Okay.
here you see, we come back to this question of the night watches, which still doesn't, it's not exactly the question of the Shema, but it's
Mhm.
related. Like, we're back on track.
Okay.
And like, I don't know what this whole deal without not that it wasn't interesting or not, and maybe it was just like the Stam was like, where else would I put it? You know, we just had this story about Elijah warning against the ruins, so we have to put this here.
Yeah,
But
we're like, this is important.
yeah, we don't have a whole tractate on ruins or prostitution, so I guess we'll just put it here.
Right, for safety concerns.
For safety concerns. All right, so we're back on the question of watches. We're getting close to the end, so I'm gonna kind of skim this a little bit. We bring this quote from Judges. Gideon is one of the like middling judges of Israel before, after Joshua, before the kings. He's somewhere in that cycle. Before Devorah. And we're just still kind of figuring out how is the night divided? How do we know when the first watch ends and I can say the evening Shema, or like it's too late now to still say the evening Shema or whatever. Which, by the way, none of this also in the one of the first page, like we had the opinion from Rabban Gamliel that you can say it until the sun rises again. So I don't know, we've kind of abandoned that point for a while.
Mhm.
So we're just arguing here about the division of the night. Okay, getting off track again. We're going to talk about dead people. I don't know. Do we ever come back to the Shema in this section? Nope, it appears not. Yeah, Mom.
So for us, in this study, we're really just sort of we're trying to learn, how the Talmud is laid out and who contributed to it and how it was contributed to and maybe when. But it's so easy to get then bogged down in what do they mean by a watch and how many watches were there in the night. And for us, with what you're trying to teach us right now, that's really not what we're trying to learn.
Right.
Correct? We're just trying to learn that there's no real rhyme or reason to how this was put together. Well, there's some reason. And that it could have been a bunch of frat boys just creating their version of the National Lampoon.
Yeah, basically.
All right, that's my comment.
Okay.
I'll shut up now.
No, don't.
So my question is
Yeah.
sort of related to that. Bunch of frat boys. Our image today of people in the study hall breaking up into study groups of two people studying the Talmud and arguing about the Talmud in their studies. So in the section, for instance, that we just read, what would the argument would be like? I mean, the argument is, I see the argument in the page, but what are the people who are studying arguing about?
Like the section about the suspicion of prostitution?
Pick one. I just yeah. As they're looking
I
at this,
imagine it like, you ever have a conversation, not necessarily a conversation you go into with an intent to structure, but you know, you start out talking about one thing and then it just kind of like the conversation flows, and then somebody brings up something else, and then you ask a question, and then they answer the question that reminds you of something else, and you tell a different story, and then they ask you a question, and like soon you're talking about something entirely different, and then like you exhaust the conversation, you kind of sit back and go, huh, how did we get there? You know, I think it's a lot like that. They start with the Mishnah, right? Like they start with the teacher or the student of the day, you know, whoever presenting. From what I have, a lot of it is speculation. So most of like what I can read or imagine about these rabbis is like fictionalized, because all we really know is what's in the Talmud for the most part. But it seems that there would often be like a student presenter sort of,
Okay.
whose job for the day would be to recite the Mishnah that the teacher would have told them previously, like, this is what we're going to study, be ready to recite the whole thing out loud, and
Okay.
then present your question, your like opening argument for the class, and then everyone would pair off and start having their arguments. And then, if each person comes up with a different, like ends up in a different place in their own pairing, and then they report back at, to the, class comes back together and they share what they learned or what they discussed. And then various parts of all of that are passed down. To
It
the
reminds,
Sivan. Like it's so, I just feel like overwhelmed thinking about how much the later rabbis then had to memorize. Like
It rem-
so much of this was chaotic in its production and like random and natural in conversation. And then somebody memorized it and like tried to make order out of it for us. It's crazy.
So would I don't know, Mendel and Chaim sitting at the Avenue R Sephardic temple today, talking about whatever part of the Talmud they were talking about, would they be arguing about whether it's right or wrong, or would they be arguing how it should affect your daily life, or what, or all of the above? I mean,
so obviously I've not been to a traditional
obviously.
yeshiva. They don't let me in. So I guess I'm not entirely sure. My experience with like Svara or Hadar, which are more traditional approaches to Talmudic study. When I learned in rabbinical school, we learned from a very academic place of like, this is how you read Talmud, this is how you understand it, this is the logical exercise of it, this is the history. We did not particularly read it for halachic intent.
Okay.
So that's how I'm trained. But I have attended some classes, or like I attended a 3-week 3-session course with Svara, which is based out of Chicago, but they did a pop-up at Addis, Israel. And they're the radically traditional yeshiva is their tagline. Or my friend Dasi does her Talmud shiur. She does a daf yomi for her community, but it's on Zoom. So when I was on track with daf yomi, I would join. And she has a more traditional approach. And so what they do is like, we're reading it and we're trying, and it's not as much argumentation anymore. It's more like, do we understand how they got to the halachic conclusion they got to? Are we following each part? Like, instead of where I might be more inclined to be like, this whole tangent about the ruins is like silly and like doesn't it, we've lost the thread. They'll be like, how is the thread still there? Let's find it. And and really try to derive meaning. And oh, they're still here. Yeah, and then some of it is to like, I guess to your point of how does this answer our questions today, or how is this relevant to our life today? So with Hadar or Philadelphia Shtibel, there is more likelihood to be more halachically observant people than at Svara. So Svara tends to be also more of like, even though it's a radically traditional approach to
Doesn't make a
Talmud
difference,
study,
but-
their purpose is a little bit more in line with what I'm always
'Cause I
trying
haven't
to
accepted
encourage
it.
more Reform Jews to do, of like, we go back to the sources so we understand the argument and we know where it went off the rails. So if we want to change halacha, we go back to, we go back to the source and divert. Whereas when I've sat in on others with more halakhically observant people studying, then you do hear like, oh, I understand now why we do this. This is the halakha now, and like I see where that came from now, and or maybe like I'm gonna go back to such and such, a more tradition or like a more ancient understanding of this rule instead of all of the fences that have since been drawn around it, and like that kind of attitude.
I can see some different directions depending on what your background is. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Hi. I thought you guys just left because
We
it
got
was
kicked
almost
off.
done.
We didn't have
Sorry.
internet for
We
2
lost
minutes.
internet for a few minutes.
I don't know what happened. All right, well, that is page 3 of Berachot. It ends with a whole nother tangent that's sort of about the watches, but is really about argumentation about a story from sort of the end of 2 Samuel, the end of David's life when all of his children are fighting for the throne. So like that's the Talmud for you. It goes in a lot of directions. It does not always linear. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So for next week, we'll shift. Let's see. Whoops. Oh, I cannot minimize when I'm recording. All right. So we're currently in Yevamot. Hold on. Can I look at? So for next week, I want to shift to somewhere near the Daf Yomi stuff. I'm trying to look at where we are right now. So today's Daf, for example, is Yevamot 104. Which is almost the end. So let's say next week we'll look at page Daf 107 of Yevamot. I'll put it on the page and everything. And we'll just kind of see, like, it's a huge jump in, but since the Talmud's not linear, it shouldn't really be a huge problem.
We shouldn't notice.
Yeah.
Especially us.
And then we'll hear a little bit about, what the rest of the Jewish world is studying this week in Talmud. Any last questions?
Just certainly easy to see why it takes 7.5 years to
Yes.
study it.
Yes, I was thinking that too, Nancy.
Yeah.
And before we go, Nancy, I want to thank you for sharing your very, very special news. And I think we were just full of ourselves and being silly, but
No, not at-
don't feel we gave you the importance of what you completed.
Oh, no, I'm always up for the silly comments, as you can see in my comments today. It makes me feel like part of the group.
All right, high
Like, even though
five
we're
on
Thank you.
that.
All right. Thanks, everyone. This was a
Thank you,
good
Rabbi.
time.
Thank
See you
you.
next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.